What's up guys, Agent here again with another build video, and today we're going to be going over the Magicka Sorcerer. Specifically, this is going to be a non-pet build, so we're not going to be using the Scamp. So the Magsorc unfortunately did get hit a little bit by Murkmire, mainly in the shields aspect. Actually, that's probably the biggest kind of nerf that the Sorcerer got in Murkmire is the change with the Sorc shield. Other than that, it actually got a slight buff when it came to its abilities, and the fact that Crystal Frags now no longer has a cast time associated with it, and the fact that the Scamp actually got a reduction cost. Of course, this is a non-pet build, so overall we did see a sustained nerf just because of the increase to the cost of elemental weapon. So sustain still really sucks on a Magsorc. It's probably one of the harder rotations to completely sustain using just light attacks. But beyond, besides that, Sorcs are still pretty much wanted in endgame content. Ignore anybody who says Sorcs are dead in PvE. They are still pretty much well and alive in PvE content. They're still pulling very good DPS, and in groups that don't have a Sorc healer, you'll commonly see a Magsorc in group for that additional conduit synergy. So just ignore the naysayers. Magsorc are still plenty strong in PvE following Murkmire. So just like the rest of our build videos, we'll be going over our gear, our skills, our attributes, everything you need to know to kind of create this build yourself. We'll be going over a couple of different gear substitutions, just kind of talk about what you want to do if you don't have certain DLCs or expansions, and then we'll be going over our rotation, just kind of talk through what the rotation is going to look like, and then do a 6 million dummy parse so you guys can get an idea of the amount of DPS that you can pull with this particular build. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started here first, as always, with our gear. So this is just one particular setup that you can run. There are going to be some other setups that you might run instead, depending on what DLCs you have access to and whether you have like Somerset or Morrowind. So our Monster Helm set is going to be Zaan. So Zaan is still the strongest Monster Helm set in the game if you're able to stay within melee range and a boss or you are not moving around too much. That being said though, if you have to play at range or the boss or you have to move around a lot during the fight, then Zaan does lose a crap ton of its power. So in that instance, you might want to use something like Ilambris instead or Skoria. Both helms are in the base game, so you will be able to get those regardless of whether you have DLCs or not. Zaan, however, does come from Scalecaller Peak, so you will need to have access to the sorry, I forget what the DLC is called, but you will need to have access to Scalecaller Peak in order to get Zaan. Now, for our first 5-piece, we're going with Siroria. So Siroria does come from Somerset, so you Cloud Rest. So you will need to have access to the Somerset expansion in order to get Siroria. I have the perfect version here, but you can use the imperfect version. The difference between them is pretty small overall, so you just pick whichever one you manage to get first. You just have to make sure that all 5 of the pieces are from the same set, so you can't mix and match perfect and imperfect. They all have to be from the same armor class. So this is actually going to be our front bar set here. So we do have a Siroria's Perfect Inferno Staff on our front bar. Then our second 5-piece is going to be Spell Strategist. This is a PvP set that comes from rewards from the Worthy. So you can buy this off of Guild Traders if you don't want to PvP and farm for those set pieces. So this is actually going to be active on our body at all times. So we have 3 Druid pieces and 2 body pieces, but you can actually swap where Spell Strategist and Siroria are. The DPS difference there is going to be very, very small. So you can pretty much pick whichever Inferno staff you happen to get first and use that as your front bars set. Now, if you don't have access to Siroria, so if you don't have the Somerset DLC, there are a few options that you can choose from. One option that you might want to consider is going to be a Scathing Mage, because if you don't have Somerset, you also don't have access to the Psijic skill tree. So in that instance, you will not be able to use Elemental Weapon, in which case your spammable is going to be Force Pulse or Crushing Shock. So that's 3 direct damage hits, so Scathing Mage does become a little bit stronger because you have Force Pulse as your spammable instead. This does require you to have the Imperial City DLC, however. So if you don't have that, because Scathing Mage does come from Imperial Prison dungeon, if you don't have access to Imperial Imperial City Prison, then the other set is going to be Julianos. I don't have a set readily available with me, but that is a craftable set from Hrothgar. So even if you don't have the Hrothgar DLC, you can still purchase it off of Guild Traders or ask somebody to create it for you who does have the Hrothgar DLC. So Julianos would probably be the next strongest set that you want to pick here. For a non-pet Sorc. So those are kind of your options there. One last set that you might want to consider picking up is going to be Netch's Touch. It's not going to be very strong in this particular build compared to Julianos, just because we are using double Inferno staves, so we will not be able to benefit from Netch's 5-piece effect as much, which is to increase our shock damage. Alright. So in terms of traits and enchants, so I have infused on my large pieces with max Magicka enchants. The exception is the head piece. This is divines with a max health enchant, because we are going to be using Clockwork Citrus for light, so we do need that little bit of additional health there. Plus our shield does scale with our health, so if we do want to have a little bit larger shield, we'll need to add a little bit more health as well. Now if we are going to be running Skoria, Skoria does have a health bonus, so you can go with infused with a max Magicka enchant like I have here. But that's kind of up to you whether or not you're going to be using Skoria or not. If you're using Ilambris, Ilambris has a max Magicka as the one piece, so you will need to go with a health enchant if you want to have a good level of health. Our small pieces are all divines with max Magicka enchants here. For our jewelry, I have 3 Bloodthirsty. You can go with Arcane. Any combination of Arcane and Bloodthirsty will do perfectly fine. 3 Bloodthirsty is the strongest combination, but Arcane does help you out a little bit more in the front half of the fight before Bloodthirsty can activate. So Bloodthirsty is going to be a little bit stronger overall in most scenarios, but Arcane does definitely pack quite a punch as well. Now in terms of jewelry enchants, I have 2 spell damage glyphs and 1 regen glyph, because again, mag Sorcs have pretty bad sustain overall, so we do want to have the additional Magicka regen glyph there to help out our sustain. We can replace it with a spell damage glyph if you would like, because we are going to be using spell symmetry or balance. So it is possible to sustain it, but it does become a little bit riskier because you are using your health in order to get your magic back. So it's kind of a trade-off that you have to make there. For our weapons, infused with the flame damage enchant, that's going to be on our front bar. So again, we have Siroria as our front bar set here, but you can use Spell Strategist instead. And then Maelstrom Inferno staff infused with an absorb Magicka enchant on the back bar. And again, that's just to help out with sustain here. You can replace this with a weapon damage enchant or a shock damage enchant. It's kind of up to you. You will be losing out on that additional sustain from the absorb Magicka. But again, if you are willing to kind of make that sacrifice to basically hit balance every time you're on your back bar rotation, it is possible to sustain without this absorb Magicka enchant, although I personally would not recommend it. Now going over our character sheet here, so we are a Dark Elf, and that's just because we are using double Inferno staves, so we do have a little bit more fire damage on this build. So Dark Elves do end up pulling pretty much toe-to-toe with High Elves, which would be our other option there. High Elves have a little bit better sustain overall because they do have 9% additional Magicka regen compared to Dark Elves, which have no additional Magicka regen. The trade-off there is that you will be losing 3% flame damage, you will be gaining 2% shock and frost damage compared to the Dark Elf. So you basically Dark Elves have a little bit of additional flame damage, but you do lose out on sustain that regen. You can also be a Breton as well if you would like. Bretons get 10% additional max Magicka and 3% cost reduction in all Magicka abilities, so that's another option there. Not quite as strong as Dark Elves or High Elves, but it's still an option there if you'd like to play it. And then there are obviously any race that has any sort of max Magicka bonus. So Argonians, even though they only have 3% max Magicka, could be usable. If you actually are going to be PvPing on this tune as well, Argonians are actually a very good choice for additional sustain from their potion passive. Now for attribute points, I have 64 points into Magicka right now, so that leaves us with 16.6k health with Clockwork Citrus Flight and 1 health glyph. So if you do feel like you need a little bit more survivability, by all means you can shift some points from Magicka into health. I personally would put probably no more than 5 or 6 points into here, just because you don't want to give up too much max Magicka, because then that's you're going to be seeing a little bit of a drop in sustain and a drop in DPS the more points you shift from Magicka into health there. For Mundus, we're running the Thief. You can go with the Apprentice if you would like, or even the Lover. If you decide to go with the Lover, just make sure your penetration cap is still at 18,200 or just slightly below it. You just don't want to hit that cap if you're running the Lover. There might be instances where you're not running Alkosh, so that are those situations where the Lover might end up beating out the Thief. Then Apprentice will pull pretty similar DPS to the Thief, so it's kind of up to you which one you would like to run. I am a werewolf because I am on the PTS and they do not give us vampire at full level, unfortunately. So I would have to level it all the way up to level 10. But normally you would be a vampire for the additional 10% additional Magicka regen. It is optional, you don't have to do it, but the additional regen is very nice to have there. And then we are using Clockwork Citrus Fillet as our food here for the additional Magicka regen. You can go with blue food if you would like. Again, you are running balance and spell symmetry on this particular build, so you do have that additional sustain if you're willing to make that sacrifice to basically damage yourself to get that additional sustain. I personally prefer running Clockwork on all my Magicka tunes for the sustain bonus, but you could reasonably get away with it using blue food with good orb support and absorb Magicka enchant on your back bar and a Magicka regen glyph. It is possible to do so, although it's very difficult to sustain a light attack rotation that way. Now going over our skills here, starting off with our front bar, we have Crystal Fragments, Elemental Weapon, Bound Aegis, Endless Fury, Inner Light, and Fiery Rage. Now again, if you do not have access to Somerset DLC expansion, you will not be able to use Elemental Weapon. In this case, you would be using Crushing Shock or Force Pulse instead of just Bound, and then you can replace Fiery Rage with the Storm Atronach instead for the additional spell damage on that front bar there. So that's something you can choose. Endless Fury, you can go with either morph here, but Endless Fury will be a little bit stronger for sustain in trash pulls if you're able to get that additional kill shot there, for you get some Magicka back there. Now for our back bar, we have Haunting Curse, Liquid Lightning, we're running Spell Sim for additional regen, Blockade of Fire, and this is where we would put our shield. So I do prefer using the Sword Shield here. Due to the changes with how shields work, you basically have two options here. You can go with Hardened Ward or Conjured Ward. If you have a Warden Healer in group, because one of their abilities, Fungal Growth, does provide minor intellect, you can go with Hardened Ward in that case, because then you don't have, because then your Warden Healer will be providing minor intellect, so you will get a little bit better shield with Hardened Ward, but Conjured Ward will give you that minor intellect. So if you don't have a Warden Healer, then you might want to run Conjured Ward instead. Conjured Ward is capped at 40% of your health, so you will have a smaller damage shield, but this is where we would put our shield here. If you want to, you can by all means go with the light armor shield, but overall the Sorc shield is going to be a little bit stronger, well, not stronger, but it's cheaper to use, so it's kind of up to you which one you would like. Hardened Ward has the exact same amount of shield as Dampened Magicka, at least the cap is the same, just costs 1000 Magicka less. Then for ultimate, we have the Greater Storm Atronach. This is going to be our main single target ultimate of choice here, and it's also very useful for that major Berserk synergy, especially for your stamina DPS. So one thing to keep in mind with where you're placing it is that while it is despawning, so after the timer is up, it counts as basically a solid entity. So if it's between a DPS and a boss, the DPS will not be able to target the boss while it is despawning. So that's just something to keep in mind when you decide, try to figure out where you want to place it here. For AoE stuff, you might want to use Fiery Rage instead. So if you need the additional cleave, then I would use Fiery Rage. So that's something to keep in mind as well if you're using Force Pulse instead of Elemental Weapon. I did say earlier you can use Atronach on your front bar, but in those cleave scenarios, you might want to consider running the Destro ulti instead, depending on how many other people are also running Destro ultis in your group. Now for our champion points, CP cap is now 810, which gives us 270 points to put across each with different CP trees. So with our green CPs, we have 75 into Arcanist and 75 into Tenacity. That leaves 120 points to put into the remaining notes. Now I like to take a very balanced approach, so I have 40 Shadow Ward, 40 Tumbling, and 40 Warlord, but it's kind of up to you where you want to spend those remaining 120 points. If you'd like, you can even push these up to 100 to get that last percentage point, and then put the remaining points elsewhere. Now for our blue CPs, I do want to mention here that these particular setup here is kind of centered around a optimized group. So we do have Alkosh, we're assuming we have Alkosh, and we're assuming we have Crusher, and we are also assuming we have very good uptimes on both of them. So depending on your specific group, the uptimes you can expect with Alkosh and Torux, you might need to put a couple more points into Spell Erosion to kind of make up for that loss of penetration. If you do need those extra points, just take points out of Staff Expert and drop Mastered Arms down to 61. That'll give you 14 more points to push this up to 40 if you would like. So I have 61 Elfborn, 64 Elemental Expert, 26 Spell Erosion, 9 Staff Expert, 66 into Mastered Arms, and 44 into Thaumaturge. Now for our red CPs, this is a more balanced approach, a little bit more towards mitigating direct damage. So you might want to shift these points around depending on the content that you're running in order to best maximize your mitigation for that specific trial or dungeon or that you're running. So I have 81 points into Ironclad, 61 points into Thick-Skinned, and I actually have to shift these points out of Bastion and put them into Hardy, 64 into Hardy and Elemental Defender. Now you can put 10 points into Bastion or Quick Recovery. I personally would probably put them in a Quick Recovery just because you won't get very much use out of Bastion in a PvE scenario. If you do decide to PvP, Bastion might be useful to invest in, but typically speaking in PvP you will have a completely different red CP setup, so I personally would not recommend putting points into Bastion as a Magicka DPS. I'll just put them in a Quick Recovery instead. That'll give you field position if you have 10 points in there, and that helps basically if you're resurrecting somebody, it'll reduce the amount of damage you take by 15%. So that's nice to have, especially in progression style groups where you might expect to be dying and resurrecting more often than like a score running group. It's up to you. You don't have to put 10 points in recovery if you don't want to. Alright, so that is pretty much it for the build itself. So now let's go ahead and go over our rotation. So our rotation has pretty much stayed exactly the same between Wolf Hunter and Murkmire. So starting off with our back bar, we're going to be going Liquid Lightning and Blockade first, and then obviously we're going to be using Haunting Curse. We're going to try to have that on cooldown, so basically after the second curse goes off, we are going to try to swap to our back bar and place it down almost immediately, even if that means we have to do something like put the curse and then swap to our front bar for 1 or 2 spambles and then swap back to our back bar to put back our dots. Now, depending on how much help you're getting with orbs and things like that, you might want to use balance every other time you're on your back bar, every time you're on your back bar. It's kind of up to you. The main thing you have to remember is if every time you use balance, you're giving up some health. So try to time when you're using balance. Don't use it in, for example, before a poison phase in the serpent fight or something like that. Try to time it so you're taking that damage in a place where you can get healed up by healers and not take a lot of damage. So like, if you're going to be using balance in like Asylum, don't do it before Storm the Heavens or something like that. So our rotation pretty much goes like this. It's pretty much going to be you drop your Atro first, you do what you have to do. If you're not using Spell Sim or Balance and you're using something like Trap or Channel Acceleration for Minor Force, I would usually use that as well. I personally would just keep on using Balance or Spell Sim even in a trial scenario, just because that sustain is so much more important than the Minor Force. Of course, if you do have good group support, you might not need Balance, so in that case, go ahead, run Channel Acceleration. So this is what the rotation is going to look like. Try to get to a point where you can see what we do with the second curse. So in this case, we would recast curse and go back to our front bar and continue the rotation that way, and then swap our back bar again, reapply the dots when they run out, and just repeat and rinse the other and repeat. Now, Crystal Frags is a proc. So basically what that means is every time you use an ability with magic that uses up Magicka, you have a chance to proc Crystal Frags. So there you see the proc. So I do have Srendar and Action Duration Reminder, so those, I think it's Srendar at least, that gives me that audio cue. You won't have that on consoles or on the base game without add-ons. So make sure you have some sort of add-on that gives you an audio cue. Just makes it easier to see. Without that add-on, all you'll see is basically you'll have your hands will start to glow. So it's a lot harder to get that down. Now, with Crystal Frags, you need to use the proc right when you see it, because you can't basically store up frag procs. So if you have one frag proc and you don't use it and you get a second one while your first one is still up, it'll just refresh that proc duration. You will not be able to use 2 frag procs. So you're going to want to use that frag proc right away, so that way it basically cleans that slate, so you're able to get a second frag proc right away. So that's something you want to keep in mind there with your frag procs. Now, going into execute phase, you will not be using your Spamble anymore. You'll be using Endless Fury or Mage's Wrath. You will still want to use a frag proc at most every 20 seconds in order to maintain the minor prophecy buff that you get from the dark magic skill tree from exploitation. So that's just something you want to keep in mind. Unless there, of course, is another Sork in group, in which case you don't necessarily have to use crystal frags when it procs and execute, but it's still nice to have that there to maintain that minor prophecy uptime in your group. Alright, so Sork rotation is fairly straightforward. The only thing that's kind of dynamic is when you have the frag procs and when you have to recast Haunting Curse. So that's kind of the only dynamic part of it. Other than that, it's pretty much, it's fairly static otherwise. So we're going to go ahead and do a 6-minute dummy parse to give you an idea of the kind of DPS you can pull. So this is going to be comparable to other Magicka DPS. So don't compare this to Stamina DPS or anything like that. Make sure you're comparing this to a Magicka DPS. One thing I do want to make note of here is the sustain. So at the end of this, when we go over our common metrics parse, we'll see how many times we had to use spell symmetry. So that'll give you an idea of the sustain that you can expect to see on a Mag Sork, and you can compare that to other Magicka DPS classes. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started with this parse. So in terms of when I like to use spell sim, I like to use it every single time I'm on my back bar, assuming conditions allow it, obviously, in the trial. So like I mentioned, I would obviously not be doing this like right before Storm to Heavens or something. So every time I reapply Blockade or Liquid Lighting, that's when I would use Balance or Spell Sim. So you can see here that helps keep me top off. So because we are running Siroria on our front bar, we just have to be mindful of the proc itself. We don't want to necessarily let it run out when we're on our back bar. The buff does last for 5 seconds after the circle disappears, so you do have some time in case it disappears right when you swap to your back bar. But if you have to swap to your back bar to get that Siroria proc back up, then go ahead and do it. It's more important to maintain that Siroria proc than it is to finish off your rotation. So now we're going into execute. So we drop Haunting Curse and execute. Not enough Magicka to finish it. Nope, not enough Magicka to finish it. So I did run out of Magicka at the end there. Probably could have done another spell sim. Thought I'd be able to finish it. Turns out I was not able to do it. I miscalculated there, but we still got a pretty decent parse here. So 44k is what we managed to pull here. I have seen higher numbers from better Sorks. I don't normally play Sork anymore, so I'm not quite as comfortable with the rotation here. And we did have some drop off here with Siroria here, so if we had 100% uptime on Siroria, we'd be seeing closer to about 84 to 85%. So I do recommend picking up a add-on just called Siroria. That'll help you keep track of the proc itself. I highly recommend it if you're running it on the front bar. If you're running Spell Symmetry on your front bar rather than Siroria, then you don't have to worry about it. You will have pretty much 100% uptime on a dummy. Obviously, in a trial, you still want to have that Siroria add-on to help you keep track of your stacks while you're moving around. So you can see here, Liquid Lightning and Blockade are very powerful dots here. And then, of course, light attacks are going to be disproportionately higher on a dummy parse because we aren't doing mechanics or anything, but light attacks are still really important. They'll still be up here in one of the top 3 spots here. Crystal frags, we had 17 procs that time. So Sork parses are kind of hitting hit or miss sometimes depending on frag procs. So this is another parse that I did earlier, just testing out a couple of things, and you saw I had 15 frag procs, and here's a lower parse here where I got 18 frag procs. So there's a little bit of RNG, but normally you can expect about this many in a 6-1 dummy parse, somewhere between 15 and 20. Alright, and beyond all that, you can see here that Absorb Magicka actually does a decent amount of DPS. So it does about the same amount as our front bar, and that's just because the Absorb Magicka enchant's pretty much proccing on cooldown, and it gives us a good 182 additional regen. And you can see here we did spell symmetry 9 times in the entirety of the parse. So you can compare that with something like a Magicka Templar, Magicka Nightblade, or a Magden to kind of see how bad the sustain is. So you can see here our disparity is about just shy of 200, so that's a little bit larger than other Magicka DPS classes. So like I said in the beginning of this video, Maxworks are pretty much dead last when it comes to sustain, probably only rivaled by Magicka DKs in terms of sustain issues. So this is probably one of the bigger issues, but probably causes one of the reasons why Maxworks aren't able to pull the same levels of DPS as a Nightblade or a Templar in Murkmire. So that is it for this build video. Let me know down in the comment section below if you guys have any questions or comments. I will try to find a parse from a better Sorc. We do have one in Hellfire Dominion that I believe managed to pull like a 50k parse solo on a Mag Sorc. So I'll try to see if I can dig up that parse that he did on Murkmire 4.2.4. So that's it for this video. Hope you guys found it informative, and I will see you guys in the next dungeon.